Alrighty, well, let's get this party started, shall we? Hopefully you can see my screen share. I normally don't display my slides in full screen mode because I tend to switch back and forth between the slides and the demo environment, and we'll do that today. Well, thanks again, to echo what Alyssa said a moment ago. Thanks a lot for joining us today for this free seminar series called Becoming a Microsoft Azure Administrator. This is session 1 of 6, and it's called On-Premises to the Cloud, Shifting Your Paradigm. And I'm happy to be your instructor for this series. Tim Warner's my name. If I look a little discombobulated, it's because I am. I've got a bunch of monitors here, and I'm trying to figure out which end is up. Okay. Our agenda for today's session is as follows. We're going to start by setting expectations. Why are you here? What do you hope to get out of this series? What can you expect to walk away from this session with? And then in the subsequent 5 weeks, what is our end goal and how are we going to get there? Specifically, we're concerned with the Azure Administrator job role. So my goal, one of my goals, is to make sure you understand what that job involves, both from a big picture standpoint. What are the salary expectations, let's just say? What does the job market look like in your area of the world for that position? But also, what is the job like day by day, hour by hour? It's a fascinating job role. We're going to review cloud computing fundamentals because I'm assuming absolutely nothing of your pre-existing skill set. You may already be working in cloud computing or you may be completely new to it. Everybody is welcome at this session. I make no assumptions. And I'm going to give you some homework, and I'm also going to give you some practical steps to help you to begin your journey. Okay, so it looks like all systems are go. When I get to the first demo, I'm going to stop my headshot image so I can focus on the slides. Actually, I better do that now. But before I do, let me say one more time, thank you for being with us. Good afternoon, good evening, good night, good morning, wherever you are in the world. Especially if you're with us here in the middle of the night, I take that as a huge compliment. Thank you. I know that we plan to make these session recordings publicly available to everybody. You don't have to be a Pluralsight subscriber ASAP, and I'm sure we'll be releasing more details about that as we go on. Okay, so let me stop video so I can focus on my teaching here, and I'll bring the headshot video back at the end when we do Q&A. Speaking of which, let me start my timer. Ugh, I knew I was forgetting something here. I'm going to present about 50 minutes of material, 48 now, and then we'll spend the rest of our time together doing questions and answers. So absolutely, load me up with questions. That's why I'm here to answer them. Alyssa's going through those questions as we speak, and then she'll just fire them at me one at a time as soon as I'm finished with the presentation. All right, seminar series overview. We've got 6 sessions in total. Today, as I just explained, is called Shifting Your Paradigm. And if you're not sure what a paradigm is, that's fine. We'll explain that in just a moment. We'll then spend the next couple sessions getting up to speed with the core services in Microsoft Azure. And I've decided to divide them by their service delivery model. We'll start with infrastructure as a service because, in my experience, that tends to be the most familiar scenario for IT professionals, running virtual machines in Azure. Next, in session 3, get up to speed with Azure Platform as a Service. This really brings out some magic because I love personally working as an Azure architect and seeing customers' eyes light up when they realize how trivially easy it is to do things in the Azure cloud as compared to doing the same things on premises. So we'll get up to speed with some of those hosted services and some of the points to ponder, things to consider. In session 4, I borrow from Microsoft's Donovan Brown, at least the title of the session, sprinkle some Azure DevOps on it. What's all this commotion about DevOps, and how does DevOps fit in when you're in an Azure hybrid cloud or cloud-only environment? Session 5 and 6 basically are bookends where we get into skill development. Again, getting towards the end here, so you're really, you want to walk away with some marching orders. At least that's how I normally am as a student. So skills development, theory and practice. And then lastly, for those of you who are interested in attaining one or more of the Microsoft Azure role-based certifications, we'll spend the 6th session doing that, skills development with certification. Okay, now I do have some session materials for you, and I'll be showing this link quite a bit. If you want to jot it down now or take a screenshot, that's fine. timw.info/admin. That short link will take you out to one of my GitHub repositories, and it contains, at this point, not too much. In fact, as promised, I'm going to ping pong into my demo environment here and show you. If you go to timw.info/admin, you'll come to my Timothy Warner/admin repo. And like I said, all I have in here now is the README file has a registration link, which is a moot point because you're here. The session dates and times, I've given them in my local time, and then the session titles. But then we have a copy of my slide deck. I've made a PDF version of it. And as we go on, session 2 through 6, eventually there'll be 6 PDFs logically. And my goal is, based on the questions and answers that I give you in our discussions, I'll be able to add additional helpful resources in this repository. Now, if you're not familiar with Git or GitHub, you might look at this file list and wonder, well, how the heck do I get these files? You don't have to have a GitHub account to obtain the files. It's nice if you do, especially if you want to be an Azure administrator, because so much of Azure's own products and documentation live in GitHub. And especially as you embrace DevOps methodology, even as an administrator, you may not necessarily be a programmer, but at the very least, you're going to need to get familiar with source code control. But at any rate, what you want to do is come down here to this green clone or download button. And if you open that up, you can click download zip, and that'll bring down the entire repository, such as it is, as a zip archive. Otherwise, as you know, if you're familiar with Git, you can clone the repo. But understand that my goal anyway is that this repo will grow over time. timw.info/admin, and I'll give you that link at the end of the session as well. Okay, so let's start to get into it here. What exactly is an Azure administrator? Is there a standard definition of this job role? Well, yes and no. Because we're talking about Microsoft Azure's cloud specifically, Microsoft has a published job role definition, and it is an IT professional who implements, manages, and monitors identity, governance, storage, compute, and virtual networks in an Azure cloud environment. It's a little bit theoretical, a little bit generic. That's why I editorialized and put in theoretical here, because in my experience, in my own work experience, and also having students all around the world who've told me about their day-to-day work as an Azure administrator, I think a more practical definition of the job role, and I'm being a little bit humorous here, but mostly serious, is an IT professional who becomes their company's subject matter expert on Azure and winds up helping development, QA, support, security, DevOps engineers get productive in Azure. I've seen this time and time and time again, largely because so many businesses, especially with this pandemic lately, have begun to rely more upon public cloud services like AWS, Google Cloud Platform, or Microsoft Azure. And so given that there's normally a skills gap, and you may be nominated against your will or with your will, the company's resident SME on Azure, and this is really borne out. So I will stop right now and apply Tim's cautionary tale number 1. In order to succeed as an Azure administrator, you really have to adopt a perpetual learner's persona. That is to say, you need to be comfortable with daily change and always studying and always broadening and deepening your skill set. That's how contemporary IT works largely now, and certainly that's the case in the Azure public cloud. Now, to answer the question about salary expectations, forgive me that I'm only using USD here. You could do an appropriate conversion, I know. And I just did some basic web searching, looking at some salary survey data, and I've given you short links to where I obtained these numbers on the slide. You can see that a starting salary for an Azure administrator is pretty nice, but I will say that this figure that you're seeing here, 100,000, 106, 122. Of course, that's going to depend on your geographic region, and it's going to depend upon what add-ons you're bringing to the table. What I found in my experience, based on that definition I just gave you a moment ago, is that as an Azure administrator, almost always you wind up doing some other stuff. And by other stuff, I'm talking about maybe some architecture and some design and some planning, perhaps some security hardening. And these bleed into other job roles. And as we'll eventually learn all about, Microsoft has a portfolio of role-based certifications aligned to these various and sundry roles. And although Microsoft separates them, I'd like to advise you to think about, as you're working and as you're growing your career, where your interests and aptitudes and willingness are coming together. And as you start to do these, as I call them, add-on skills to just the basic work of the Azure administrator, you're going to find that your worth in the marketplace from a salary perspective grows, I've found, beyond my wildest dreams, and I hope you find that the case as well. Common question for those of you who are currently working as full-time IT professionals is, how much of my existing sysadmin skill set can I port to Azure? Let's say, for instance, you work for an industry as a systems administrator, and you have one or more local data centers, and you may not be touching servers physically, but you're SSHing and RDPing and doing installations and configuration management and troubleshooting, a lot of the bread and butter tasks that the typical systems administrator winds up doing. How much of that skills will translate into Azure versus how much do you essentially need to throw away? Well, to answer that question, I have some good and some maybe not so good news for you. The neutral news, I guess, would be that in my experience, you're going to need to start a paradigm shift, taking your existing IT sysops knowledge, systems administration knowledge, and shift that to a new orientation. A paradigm shift is a fundamental change in approach or underlying assumptions. Simple as that. And so why this is necessary, I've got a really nice practical example here for you to think about. You see on the left part of this slide, local IT, traditional systems administration in an on-premises local campus environment. And then on the right, doing the same thing in the Azure public cloud. Let's say, for example, your team has been tasked with developing a highly available data tier for a line of business application that your business is working on. And let's say it's a Microsoft Stack application. So you're going to use SQL Server as your data tier, and you need high availability within your data center. So you'll probably want to go for failover clustering. This is going to probably involve quite a bit of time, isn't it? There's obtaining budget, there's obtaining buy-in, there's lots of bureaucracy and meetings and sign-offs, and there's provisioning purchases and waiting for hardware to come in and then kitting the hardware. There's a lot of work. I chose this example decidedly because I know from personal experience how painful it can be to do SQL Server failover clusters from scratch. Then there's the training aspect of training the staff to tend the care and the feeding of the HA cluster. And then what if the business realizes, well, if we have a lightning strike or a flood that takes out our data center, the back end of our application has gone up the flue and it's going to cost us a lot of money to recover from that. We need to take another level of high availability and replicate that cluster to another location so we have some geo availability. How long is that going to take your business to do? To go through determining co-location and contracting with another data center somewhere, depending upon where it is in the world? How does this impact your staff? It's pretty problematic, isn't it? Is that enough to contrast with Azure administration? Now, admittedly, this is kind of an extreme example, but not that much, actually. With Azure, to build a highly available data backend using SQL Server databases, you can in the Azure portal or with a couple lines of Azure PowerShell or Azure command line interface, or using the JavaScript object notation JSON deployment templates, you can do this configuration in less than 5 minutes. And that's just to get a highly available single instance database going. If you want to do geo replication, that's going to be 20 minutes is very conservative, and less than a half an hour. That's taking into account, that's not taking into account how much time it would be to put the data in the database, but just the actual mechanics of deploying this and making a database highly available around the world is under a half an hour. And the way that cloud billing works, you may know this already, is normally on a consumption model. So you're only paying for the Azure resources that you're actively consuming per billing period. That's a pretty dramatic difference, wouldn't you agree? So what I normally recommend as an Azure administrator or Azure solution architect to customers is to, instead of just assume that what you've got in your on-premises infrastructure you need to mirror in Azure, look at the cloud as a greenfield opportunity. You can get a do-over. Your TCP/IP networking and virtual LANs may be all messed up, all spaghettied on premises, but you've got an opportunity to lay out a virtual network infrastructure that meets your security, performance, and availability needs. So you don't just have to do it the way it's always been. And that also goes for something like databases. In local IT, you may be using physical servers or virtual machines. In Azure, it's always going to be virtual machines. You're never going to touch any hardware, and you'll never know exactly where the Azure data centers are. You'll know which country they're in or which part of a country or province your region is in, but you'll never know, for instance, the street address. So to demonstrate that, let me switch over to my browser environment and pop into the Azure portal. And here I'm gonna, if you're not familiar, this is the main web administration tool in Azure. It's portal.azure.com. And I'm going to do a search for SQL databases. And I have some stuff already deployed here. I've got a database called AdventureWorks. And as you can see, it's giving us which pricing tier we're on. That's something else that the cloud has that really can't compare to on-premises local administration. If you realize that your local database server is overburdened CPU-wise or memory-wise, how long is it going to take you to do an upgrade? Think of how long it takes just to order and receive the hardware. And then you have to install the hardware and you realize that the RAM isn't compatible, so you have to return it and do the whole thing. It's absurdly easy in the cloud, maybe too easy, to do things like scaling up or scaling down these different services. With a couple mouse clicks, you can give your database a completely refreshed environment. In terms of if it's too expensive and too big, you can size it down. And in Azure, you've got all of this telemetry ability here where you can watch your utilization numbers here to see where you are as far as size. I say too easy because a legitimate hazard is you don't just want to come in here and start clicking because you can, because you are in fact paying for all of the stuff that you're consuming. And if you lose track and your team loses track of some of that stuff, that could be pretty devastating. I think you'd agree. Now look here under settings, geo-replication. All we have to do to replicate this AdventureWorks database to another region in the world is just choose our target region. My home region is in East US, and I can choose, say, the West US, and fill out this form here. Of course, I'll have to specify another virtual server that I happen to have conveniently created already, kind of like the cooking shows. Do you want the secondary? It is readable by default. Elastic pool pricing tier, once again, to change the size and the performance level of these hosted services in Azure is all done in an almost trivially easy way. Now, again, I don't mean to sugarcoat this. You're going to have to learn an entirely new vocabulary when you're working in Azure. For example, although you might understand the basics of what I might be doing here, okay, you're going to resize the underlying server to give the database more or less capacity and performance. You might be thinking, well, what is basic, standard, and premium? And it gets more complicated than that yet. Again, we're talking about a paradigm shift. You don't have to throw away all of your existing knowledge, but you're absolutely going to have to build on it, because the way you do administrator work in Azure is very different than how you do it on premises. So once I click OK here, Azure is going to start going out and creating that replication. And as you can see right on the this map, it's graphically showing where we're going to have our standby. So in the event of a failure, if East US 2 were to go offline for some reason on Microsoft's side, or maybe we did a misconfiguration in our side that messed up the primary database, we could fail over to the secondary that's running in the West US. Now there's issues of latency. Again, paradigm shift. You might have years of experience working in a single campus and a single data center. Now you're thinking about having deployment spread potentially around the entire world, you see? So you may know about Ethernet and TCP/IP networking and routing and switching. That's great. That's an advantage if you have that. But you're going to have to put that knowledge on another plane when you're looking at latency and measuring performance across geo regions like you are here, because it really is a geo world when you're working in Azure. Let's come back to the slides and keep marching on. I wanted to include a little bit on just general cloud computing attributes because we're starting at the beginning here, and I just want to make sure we're all on the same playing field here, speaking the same language. If you've ever heard of the NIST, it's a US government agency, and they've published what's really the reference white paper on cloud computing. If you look in the lower left corner of this slide, timw.info/NIST will bring you to the PDF. But in that NIST white paper, there's essential characteristics of the cloud. You might have seen these before. These are just the hallmarks of what makes up a cloud computing environment. And one of those is on-demand self-service. This means that customers or your users, these could be Azure administrators, Azure developers, whomever, can provision their own resources. There's not this necessity unless you add those approval layers in, which you can. But as long as somebody comes into, say, the Azure portal and they have proper authorization, they can provision their own resources, they can configure their own resources, which lends agility to your environment, doesn't it? Because you're not waiting on approval after approval. That's feature in Azure is called role-based access control, or RBAC. Broad network access in a cloud computing system refers to how you're accessing the underlying hardware and the software services that are running in Azure. Think of networking, for instance, where you can place your virtual machines, where you can actually nowadays integrate several other Azure products and a security of a virtual network. Well, all of Azure is accessible under a REST API. And if you're not familiar with that, REST stands for Representational State Transfer. It's a way to do create, read, update, and delete operations, CRUD as it's called, using the HTTP protocol. It's pretty much a standard way to do programming nowadays. And in Azure, it's called Azure Resource Manager. You can go out onto the docs and learn about it. And anything you do as an Azure administrator, whether you're using the Azure portal or whether you're using Azure PowerShell, those are all layers on top of the Azure Resource Manager REST APIs. And the broad network access means that that ARM API is accessible in a variety of forms. Your software developers may be using, say, Visual Studio. And when you install some of the Azure Software Development Kits or SDKs, one of the core things that those SDKs are doing are translating the source code that could be written in C# or what are some other languages? Java, Python, it really doesn't matter. Many are supported natively in Azure now, but all of that is an abstraction. Under the hood, you've got HTTPS URIs going back and forth between a client and the Azure Resource Manager server, requests and responses. REST API is a beautiful thing for sure. Resource pooling refers to Azure having essentially limitless compute, network, and storage. And they can just let customers provision essentially to their heart's content those resources. There are limits, and I just can't resist. I'm going to have to come out into the demo again. I'm a huge fan of the Microsoft docs, and if you're not using them yet, please start to be familiar with them. It's docs.microsoft.com/Azure. They're all open sourced into GitHub, but this is really your source of knowledge for your Azure products. You can go to azure.com. Those are marketing pages. The Azure Docs is where you actually learn how to use the services. But anyway, my original point was there's a Docs article called Azure Service Limits and Quotas. And just FYI, this article is cool because it gives you your caps, your limits. How many resource groups can you have in your subscription? How many VMs can you put on a virtual network? You know, those kind of questions. If I scroll down a bit, you're going to see they give you some of those limits, and then eventually it gets to individual services. It's a long, long article. I find that the best way to do it is do a Control F and then just do a search for what you're looking for. Like network security groups, for instance, if you're wondering about those, it looks like the number there is 5,000. Now you have to, again, read, because sometimes there'll be two limits in Azure. There'll be a soft limit and a hard limit. And you'd have to do your due diligence, because I can't imagine you'd go beyond 5,000 NSGs in your subscription, but let's say you did. There's a chance that you could contact Azure and have them raise that limit for you, because not all of these are hard architectural limits. So it's just something to consider as we go on. And actually, that's a good thing as an Azure administrator to be aware of, to know how to look at those limits and get an answer really quickly if you're helping somebody sort out a problem. Then we've got rapid elasticity. This is what I was showing you a moment ago with Azure SQL Database, being able to scale up and down and then make the database geo available in multiple regions. One of the biggest benefits of the public cloud, being able to do that. And by the way, the differentiation between scaling up and down, that's vertical scale, versus in and out, which is also called horizontal scale, is that the scaling up and down is where you're essentially resizing the compute power of the service's underlying VM or VMs. How much virtual CPU, how much virtual RAM, the performance of a singleton instance of a service or a server. Horizontal scale is when you're doing scale out. And we don't want to get too far in the weeds for there, but let's say you've got two web front end servers, and your web site starts getting hit with more and more and more traffic to the point where those two web servers are getting overloaded. Wouldn't it be nice if you can configure Azure to auto scale out to maybe 4 instances to handle that traffic spike? And then once the traffic spike goes away, Azure is smart enough to come back down to scale in to the original orientation, which saves you money. That's eminently possible with both virtual machines. There's something called scale sets in Azure, as well as with platform as a service. Most of the PaaS services have a capacity for auto scaling. Really good stuff. Oh, and then of course there's measured service, where you're paying only for the resources you consume. Okay. I've got some screenshots from the Azure portal. This is just showing the cost management blade, where you can run reports on exactly what you're spending in Azure, and then you can forecast that out. You can do budgets, you can do alerts. Azure is really good about not hiding stuff. I've never once felt that Microsoft was intentionally trying to hide anything, really. In fact, it's quite the opposite, I've found in my experience. You have to know where the tool is. And in this case, you just do a search in the Azure portal for cost management, and here you go. But yeah, you'll know exactly where your money's going and exactly what services you're paying for. And if you don't need them, you can resize them or delete them. The 3 main service delivery models in a public cloud would be IaaS, infrastructure as a service. This, as I said before, is where you're running virtual machines, but they're running in Azure. This, I've found in my experience, tends to be the comfort feature for systems administrators who have been doing VMs for several years now. They're pretty standard, aren't they? And they run very similarly, I would say, in the cloud as they do on premises. You're even using the same management protocols, remote desktop protocol, let's say, for Windows Server, SSH, Secure Shell for Linux, for starters. For platform services, this would be things like Azure Function apps or Azure App Service apps. This is showing an app service plan, and you can see Just with a couple mouse clicks, you can adjust the scaling of the underlying servers. And what's beautiful about this platform as a service with your web apps is that you don't have to worry about making sure that those replica servers are configured identically. The custom auto scale rules mean that Azure clones the VMs by itself with no intervention necessary. It does the load balancing for you. It does the porting of the source code and the artifacts that need to be on the servers. That's all automatically done for you. It's very convenient. You might be wondering, well, is there a trade-off? And yes, there is. We'll talk more about that as we go on. And then finally, there's a typo on the slide. Software as a service should be SaaS, S-A-A-S. And this is effectively where you're using a cloud-based application as an end user, where it's all packaged and finished. And there's some SaaS available for administrators right in the Azure portal. But normally, like I say, a SaaS product like Office 365, maybe there are some APIs or application programming interfaces that are exposed where you can programmatically interact with the application. But by and large, the idea of SaaS is that it's a packaged service. Shared responsibility model. This is just a straight up slide, and I've given you the attribution in the lower left. There's a funny variant of this. I'd encourage you to do a search for the pizza as a service model. It's a nice way to describe the shared responsibility model as you go from on the left on-premises all the way onto the right software as a service. But the pizza as a service does it in terms of, well, pizza, making pizza at home on one end, and then on the other end, ordering delivery, or actually going to a pizza restaurant, eating, and then leaving. It's very clever. But what we've got here is a division of responsibility between Microsoft, the cloud provider, and you as the paying customer. And notice that that split between your responsibility and the provider's responsibility changes as we go from extreme to extreme. With on-premises, of course, you own and manage your entire infrastructure stack, networking, storage, servers, the whole deal. It's all on you. Infrastructure as a service, so let's say you've migrated some virtual machines from local data centers into Azure. You're still going to have to manage the whole VM pretty much, from the operating system to its runtime environments, to the apps and data that are on that system. It's your responsibility to back it up. It's your responsibility to secure it. Microsoft's not going to do that for you. What they're doing is providing the underlying infrastructure. They're giving you hyperscale. They're giving you worldwide network of data centers. They've got high-speed network interconnects. They've got servers, almost infinite resources there on which you can place your virtual machines, but then it's your responsibility to take it from there. So there's the trade-off. There's one trade-off. Well, why am I paying Microsoft? Well, you're paying for the underlying environment, and you're paying for features that you can use. You're responsible for securing your VMs, but guess what? Azure has a whole bunch of really helpful security tools like Azure Security Center, where Azure can give you tips on how to secure your VMs. You have to back up the VMs yourself, but guess what? Azure VM Backup, super easy to set up your cloud backups on a schedule, and you can even replicate your Azure VMs to keep them in a highly available configuration. You see? Platform as a service, notice again, the split here is much more on Microsoft's side, where they're actually responsible for the underlying compute as well as the environment. The idea here is, let's say you want to host your web application or your API application or whatever it is in, say, App Service. You're not going to get much of any control of the underlying VMs. I mean, you can resize them and you can do some stuff, but that is the trade-off. Infrastructure, you get full control of your VMs, so you've got maximum control, but generally you don't get anywhere near as much agility and speed and flexibility as you do with platform as a service. Platform as a service gives you all sorts of advantages where Microsoft is taking care of the environment for you mostly, and you can just focus on your line of business applications. What's the trade-off? Just that. You get lots of agility, but you're surrendering that full stack control. Sometimes you have to choose one or the other. Microsoft supports a bunch of web development frameworks, but not all of them. And maybe your app targets a framework version that's not supported by app service. So, I mean, it's not a terrible thing if you have to do IaaS or if you can do PaaS. It's totally up to you and your business and your needs, et cetera, et cetera. And then lastly, as I said, software as a service is where Microsoft or whoever made the app pretty much is responsible for the whole thing. And Azure is a perfectly fine platform for developing your own software as a service apps that run in Azure and you expose to your customers. All right, what are we going to do in this? I wanted to just jump out to the demo environment again, just to put some pictures to these concepts. Let's go back in the Azure portal and let me look up virtual machines. Now, you might wonder, it's just trivia, but Microsoft has the Hyper-V hypervisor. So yes, in the data centers, all of your VMs run under Hyper-V. And it's not a Windows-only world. There are several Linux distributions that Microsoft supports. You can find all that in the documentation. I've got a couple virtual machines running here, as you can see. Let's pick on Win1. Right on the overview page, we can get a really nice summary of the metadata of this VM. It'll tell us what location we're in, whether we're running or stopped, our operating system, the VM size, all that. It's a nice roll-up of just metadata. I say that because as an administrator, you may be faced with evaluating virtual machines that you didn't deploy, and you want to just get a really fast view of how this machine is set up. Does it have a public IP address? Yes or no? Looks like this case it does, you see? Now, never go into the VM, that is, never connect to the VM and start horsing around with IP addresses. That's a rookie mistake, and if you've made it, there's no shame in it. This machine I'm on right now is a VM running in Azure, and I know when I was new to Azure, I wanted to make sure that my VM had a static private IP. So what I did is what I have done thousands of times in a local environment to open up your network connections and go to properties. You know where I'm going, right? And you go to your TCP/IP properties, and no, I don't want DHCP. I'm going to set a private IP, and I'm going to even plug in my own domain controllers. Never do that. You're going to lock yourself out of the VM within seconds. This again speaks to the paradigm shift of moving from an on-premises systems administrator orientation to doing work in the cloud. In the cloud, you're working in the Azure control plane, as it's called. Specifically, right here, our VM, we can look at our networking stuff by going to this blade, and notice that all of the artifacts here are hyperlinked. As it happens, TCP/IP addressing for your VMs happens in another resource called a virtual network interface. So we actually have to click out to that VNIC and dip into its IP configurations. And then one more click will take us there. And this is where you can disassociate or associate a public internet IP if you really need one on the virtual machine. And then the private IP address that comes from the virtual network on which the VM lives, you can adjust that right here. Another thing to consider, although this is so easy, you click and then hit save and you're done. I'm going to do it right now. I'll click static, and instead of 10004, let's say I want to make that 101. And then I'm going to click save. If I'm not careful, it's actually too late. But look here, the virtual machine will be restarted to utilize it. Whoops. I know on premises you're dealing, hopefully, with maintenance windows where any configuration change is tracked in your IT service management tool, and at least everybody knows when you're going to do such and so of a change. It can be a little bit of a false security thing in the cloud because it's so easy to make these changes. A general point is when you're changing the TCP/IP configuration of a virtual machine, it winds up restarting the VM almost always. And if you have users on that, that's going to be a denial of service and not a happy day. With respect to software as a service, a good example of that I find is OneDrive. If you're familiar with the OneDrive for Business client, and finished application runs as a service here on Windows 10, and I can interact with these file system artifacts that I placed in my account. Locally, they're synchronized on my local system, and they're also synchronized up to OneDrive.com or whatever it is. I'm logged in with another account, so it's not getting me there. But again, the idea is that this is a cloud-hosted application. My files are always up in the cloud, but I can sync them down using a client, whether I'm on Windows or Mac OS or Linux or on an iPhone or a Android, it doesn't matter. I can get to my data wherever I am in the world. So we've got global reach because the actual application is running in a public cloud environment, Office 365 in the case of OneDrive. Isn't that neat? And then, as I mentioned before, although software as a service is essentially a finished application, most SaaS apps I find expose an application programming interface. So we could just do a search for OneDrive API. And the first link here in my Google search results takes us to the Microsoft OneDrive Development Center, where you can get all sorts of sample code for different platforms. Isn't that wonderful? And if you're not familiar with an API, it's just simply a programmatic way to access an application. REST API is a programmatic way to access an application using HTTP. I would imagine that this API that you use to interact with OneDrive is also a REST API. It all comes down to the same thing. All right, what else do we have here? How about setting yourself up for success? Here's some specific tips and tricks in our session 1 to get started here. If you don't have a Microsoft Azure free account yet, please do so. I've got a short link in the lower left, timw.info/free. The free account works a lot like the AWS free account does. You get 200 USD or whatever your local currency equivalent is to spend over 30 days. Now, if you spend up the $200 in 10 days, then you're done with the trial. Otherwise, if you reach the 30 days and you haven't yet spent up the $200, it goes up the flue. So one way or another, your trial is going to end. But here's the good news. Microsoft never converts your account automatically. Anything, if you have a VM running when you hit your $200, the VM will just stop and deallocate. And you'll need to attach a payment method and actually convert your account to pay as you go if you want to keep using the services. Now, there are some services, as you can see on the screenshot, that are free for 12 months, and then there's even some services that are always free. But, you can set up a very basic website for free, but Microsoft, for obvious reasons, discourages you from trying to do business with the free tier. The free tier is about experimentation and seeing if this is right for you, okay? Now, Pluralsight also has a trial account. I hope you're a subscriber. If you're not, that's fine. And again, we plan to publish these recordings available to anybody and everybody. So you don't have to have an account, although I certainly hope you do, obviously. This is showing the timw.info/PS trial. It takes you into our documentation and explains exactly how the subscription, the individual subscription works. And you see the call out here, 10 days or 200 minutes. And then I believe this does, yeah, see I think that's pink, I'm colorblind. It says important that it will convert. So that's just a little heads up I want you to be aware of. Azure does not convert. Pluralsight trial account does convert. But of course, you can always cancel at any time. Some other resources you should be aware of here as we approach the tail end of session 1 is the concept of learning paths that we have at Pluralsight. Specifically, as you can see here, and again, I give you the link, this brings you to the Microsoft Azure Administrator learning path, also called a skill path. I want to explain some of these terms because they're important. We're talking about the Microsoft Azure Administrator job role. We can also look at that role as a collection of skills. Right? Skills would be atomic things, managing storage, managing virtual machines, managing networking, that kind of stuff. And we've got this AI-backed system called Role IQ. I don't know if I have a picture of it. Nuts, I don't here. But the idea here is that you can look at a learning path. Let me jump out to one of my okay, I think I'm logged in here, yes. In the Pluralsight player here, you can get to the paths up here on the top navigation bar. And let's just quickly do a search for Azure Administrator. I'll do a Control F. Azure Oh, it's right there in front of me. And if I click that path, it lays out beginner, intermediate, and expert, all of the courses that go into that skill path. Now, the skill IQ and the role IQ are assessments that help you get a fix on what you're coming in with. That is, before you start diving into these courses, you can come in maybe at a higher level, and you don't have to start with the beginner level. You can start at the intermediate or the expert level. Let me see if I can remember how to get to role IQs on this page. I believe what I normally do is I go to Browse, and then over on the right, you've got Role IQ. The Role IQ gives you assessment and feedback on the entire job role. And then within the role, as your administrator, as I said, you've got a number of skills, and you can also do pre and post assessment on a per skill basis as well. Again, this is all in the name of you're figuring out where you are when you begin, and then you study, and you can do a post assessment. And one reason I personally like this IQ system a lot is because it's quantitative. Think about if you're already working in IT and you're coming up on your yearly performance review. How helpful would it be to show with numbers, with quantitative data, your improvement within, say, the Azure Administrator job role as you step through those skills? Yeah, so in this case specifically, the Azure Administrator role consists of 4 skills: identity, storage, networking, and compute. And each of those is going to be a collection of courses. Yes, there's a little bit of a learning curve into this, but then again, there always is, isn't there? Something else you should be aware of is Microsoft Learn. This is at the short link that I'm giving you, timw.info/msadmin. This is a completely free collection of labs. Some are hands-on, some are theoretical. You log into this with your Microsoft account, and again, it's a way to track your progress. I don't think there's anything like an assessment like we have with Skill and Role IQ. You just dive in. But you can earn completion badges, and again, this is stuff that you can leverage as you're proceeding down the path here to become an Azure administrator and even beyond, to broaden and deepen and quantify your skill set. The biggest thing that Microsoft Learn has, in my opinion, is number one, it's separated already into roles. Whoops. Like here, we're looking at the Browse All Labs page, and then if the text is kind of small, forgive me, but I've got the administrator role selected. And as of when I took this screenshot, there are 325 of these modules. So I find that you just do a search for whatever it is that you're studying, maybe Linux virtual machines. Do a search to see if there's a module on that. And chances are there's a module that includes a hands-on lab component where you can use Microsoft's Azure environment, and it's not a simulation, it's the real environment, and actually learn by doing. We at Pluralsight are also developing cloud labs for Microsoft Azure as well, so that's something to look forward to. Another resource yet would be for you to begin getting connected in the larger Azure technical community. And if you go to meetup.com and do a search for Azure, you can find user groups. Now with COVID, they're all virtual, so it doesn't even matter where the group is in the world, which is really a good thing, I think. And get plugged into some Azure-specific user groups. You can find, well, good professional associations. Many times IT recruiters make themselves known and sometimes sponsor these user groups. And oftentimes user groups do raffles and giveaways where you can obtain, for instance, Azure passes, which are free credit that you can use in Azure for your professional development. Okay. Well, I think I'm just about at the end of my 50 minutes. Before I ask Alyssa for questions, I have just a couple more slides to show you for completeness purposes. As you can see, looking ahead to session 2, we're going to go deeper, but specifically into infrastructure as a service. So if you like the little we did on virtual machines today, that was just a tease, really, to queue up on what we'll spend the entire next session on. And again, I'm going to keep honing back on translating the local campus skills, the on-premises paradigm shifting into how we do the same kind of stuff in the cloud. It's a different viewpoint. I promised that I had some homework for you, and I'm not kidding. One, I'd like to ask you, if you don't already have a Pluralsight subscription, sign up for a Pluralsight free trial account. Second, do an Azure free account. To do that, you use your Microsoft account, and you do have to do a payment method when you sign up for the Azure free trial. But believe it or not, Microsoft does not use that payment method for payment. They use it for authentication to make sure that you're not trying to redeem more than one free account. If you try to repeat the process, it's going to fail. It's not going to work. And then third, study the objectives for exam AZ-104 if you want to. I know we haven't talked much at all about certification. We will in session 6 for sure. But the latest edition of the Microsoft Azure Administrator Certification exam from Microsoft is called AZ-104. It's in beta right now, which means that you can take it at an 80% discount. So just something for you to keep in mind. And lastly, to go back up to that first checkpoint, besides signing up for a Pluralsight free trial, I also want to encourage you to go to the Azure Administrator Paths page and check that role IQ, skill IQ stuff out. Go through some assessments, take the feedback under advisement, and think about how you can leverage that going forward to study course material. All right, Arino. Before I show my contact information, let me step back to the question slide. Let me kick off my video. And Alyssa, any questions?
Hey there.
Hey.
Yeah, so we have a few. I'm going to hop on camera just so I can rattle these off to you and we can have a good back and forth as we do this Q&A. So our first one, could you give us any info on where people can get vouchers for certifications?
Certification vouchers. Well, for the AZ-104, as I said, Microsoft isn't doing vouchers. Their incentive to have you take the beta test is to just register, and you get an 80% discount. For free vouchers, that's a tougher one. Some training providers, if you're looking at Microsoft official curriculum training providers, will include a voucher in the training, but they're kind of hard to come by, to be honest with you. I will give you a tip. If you do a Google search for Microsoft certification offers, you can learn about something called, what do they call it now? It used to be called Second Shot. It's where you can pay a bit above the list price for the exam, but there's a spare voucher waiting. If you don't pass the exam on your first attempt, you get the second voucher. So it's basically an insurance policy. It's called Exam Replay, come to think of it. Not a free voucher, but that's the best I can do. Sorry.
Nice, thanks for sharing. So our second question, I'm working as an SAP consultant to SAP consultant integration and wish to be a Microsoft solution architect. Is this possible or something sensible that can be pursued?
Oh yeah, there's, to my knowledge, nothing that's stopping you. I mean, SAP is a supported workload in Azure and has been for quite a while. I'm not very familiar at all with SAP products. They're so proprietary, but I'm pretty sure they're already in the cloud. Like I said, they've got a partnership with Microsoft. Yeah, it's eminently possible. I mean, of course, the solution architect role presumes that you understand quite a bit, actually, about not only the administrator job role, but also the development job role, because the architect is looking at deciding which Azure products you'd recommend to a customer. And I'd bet you $20 to a stale jelly donut that customer has applications that they're looking to either make, support, migrate. So yes, it's possible, but if you want to go from zero to architect, I would suggest that you use as your waypoints the Azure Administrator and Azure Developer skill sets to make sure that you're coming in nice and well-rounded.
Awesome. And kind of going off of that one, we also had someone ask if this series is for someone who has basic knowledge of databases. So do you see them being able to follow along?
Yes, I do. I hope you liked the little demo I did with Azure SQL databases. Yeah, by all means. I mean, as far as Microsoft is concerned, they've actually split the data job roles into multiple job roles. As an Azure administrator, if you're already a data specialist, then you've already got some add-ons going. Remember at the beginning of this session, I mentioned that there's the typical Azure admin stuff, deployment, configuration, maintenance, troubleshooting, and then anything you can layer on top, data platform, super valuable because the data platform in Azure is enormous. It goes beyond SQL Server. I mean, there's Cosmos DB, that's Microsoft's non-relational platform, but they've got first-party or first-line support for MySQL, MariaDB, PostgreSQL, and others. Yeah, you're in a good spot if you're a data specialist.
Perfect, thank you. So our next one is, can you or will you show the failover process from one region to another and how it will revert back? And then going off of that, is there network latency issues and access data from SQL DB?
Well, I don't have time to show database failover today, so I'll just speak generally about it. I think in session 3, I'll take your point under advisement. I'll make sure to include a demo on that for session 3. So let me write that down first of all. But to complete my initial thought, the general deal with failover, whether it's a database or a virtual machine or a whole workload, is that it's customer initiated. Microsoft isn't going to presume that you want to fail over. So you could either build automation yourself if you need to automate it, otherwise it's something that a human being will press the button or flip the switch to do. Latency, yes, absolutely. That's something to be concerned with. There's a really good docs article you might want to look up. It's called Azure Paired Regions. As it happens, Microsoft creates region pairs all around the world with different regions that are kind of close to each other, but they're far enough away to give you a good degree of geo-availability. But Microsoft builds extra network interconnects between those paired regions. So the guidance is if you're going to do a failover, your first choice of a secondary region should be the region pair. And Microsoft lists all of those in that docs article. Microsoft Azure Paired Regions. Go look it up.
Thanks, Tim. Next one, can you provide an explanation of an ACU/EDTU/DTU in human terms? Sorry if I'm jumping ahead.
What's with all these TLAs, 3-letter acronyms?
Right?
Yeah, there's the paradigm shift for you. When you're on premises, you know probably what hardware is in the motherboard of your servers. In the cloud, you never do. So instead, Microsoft has this whole series of standardized performance units. For the VMs, it's the Azure Compute Unit, or ACU. For databases, the original performance metric was the Database Transaction Unit, or DTU. Yes, so long story short, all those U values are measures of relative performance. Because like I said, you'll never know what the CPU actually is. Microsoft is pretty transparent actually, but you won't. So instead, you size your workload using those values, those U's. And again, go to the documentation. Simply look that up. Azure ACU, Azure DTU, Azure eDTU, and you'll find it all spelled out for you there. The docs are awesome.
Thanks. We have a ton of questions flowing in about Azure 103 versus 104 as far as certifications. Which one would you suggest that people take?
Yeah, for sure. I would recommend that you do AZ 103. Why? Number one, those exams lead to the same badge. If you pass AZ 103 today, and then you passed AZ 104 tomorrow, it's impossible. Microsoft won't let you do that. They're indistinguishable. It's the same badge. Why do I recommend 103? Predominantly, it's because you take the exam, you get your result, and you get your badge immediately. 104 is in beta for the next few months. You do not get your score report when you complete the exam. Maybe it's just that I love instant gratification so much, but I don't like that. Waiting months to get your badge, no. So, I mean, yeah, there's the 80% discount, and I don't want to discount that discount, but the difference between the AZ 103 and 104 is basically structural. Microsoft Learning each year revisits their certs and looks at the skills and does an assessment. Do these skills still matter? Are they still the core skills for an Azure administrator, let's say? So they did that and made very minor changes. But the main change is that Microsoft reorganized the AZ-103 skills to put them in a more logical order, and they took out a few skills that were overlapping with the Azure Architect exams, because there historically has been an enormous amount of overlap between the administrator and the architect exams, and it can bleed over. So that's why Microsoft revved the version. And they have an internal practice that if the content of an exam domain changes more than 30%, they need to give it a new exam number. So that's why it's AZ-104. But I know that's a long explanation, but let me summarize it. I would suggest you do 103 so you get your badge. The content difference between 103 and 104 is very small. You can go online and do a search for exam AZ-103, and when you look at the skills measured, go to the end of the document and you'll see a table with AZ-103 on the first column and AZ-104 on the right column, so you can compare and contrast for yourself.
Okay. And kind of going off of that, do you know if Microsoft right now, if they're offering online proctored exams for any of these?
Yes, I know for a fact they are, and I am now a convinced online test taker. I hope I never darken the doors of a Pearson VUE Center for the rest of my life. No offense, because I used to work for Pearson. I love them dearly, but the online testing process has gotten really nice. And the best advice I have for you there is to do the system test. You'll find when you register for the test, actually you can do the system check without even registering. Just do a search for Microsoft Online Exams, and you can go through the process of verifying that your computer and your webcam and your environment where you plan to sit for the test is suitable. It meets the security things. And you'll go through that exact process on exam day. So yes, now more than ever before, the online testing is forefront. I don't even think the physical testing centers have begun to open yet. But like I said, I've had great experience with online testing. I've taken probably 6 or 7 exams over the last month and a half or so, and everyone has been fine because I did the system check and didn't try to bypass that. The problems I've heard people have, I believe, could have been solved if they made sure that their environment was correct.
Yeah, definitely. Is there any overlap between AZ-900 and AZ-104? They're trying to determine whether AZ-900 would be good prep for 104.
Well, if you're new to Azure or newish to Azure, you really can't go wrong with the AZ-900, the Azure Fundamentals, because you're going to come out of that process with a really nice, well-rounded, basic understanding of Azure. However, you need to keep in mind that Microsoft aims the Azure Fundamentals at technical and non-technical people, because they expect sales and marketing people who work for, say, cloud service providers or SaaS software vendors might need to take that certification to demonstrate basic knowledge. So there's nothing overly technical on AZ-900. You have to know a little bit about what virtual machines are, let's say, but it's nothing like AZ-104 where you get into the weeds of deploying, configuring, maintaining, troubleshooting VMs. So it's really up to you. But as far as the technical depth, it's quite different indeed. AZ-900 is pretty shallow compared to where you are with AZ-104. I hope that response makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. I'm just going through all of these questions really quickly to see things that we might cover later. So I'm going to go back to the top of our list. So where do containers such as Docker fall in the infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service?
Right. Normally, it's given its own service designation. I hear CAAS, Container as a Service, and it's funny that you asked this question. I was pondering that myself this morning just because. I was like, you know, really, Docker containers can be classified as a compute service when you're thinking about it. But no, they're normally given a separate category because you're moving from, like we did earlier with the slides, from infrastructure as a service to platform as a service, and then I jumped all the way to software as a service, containers would go in between platform as a service and software as a service. Because especially if you're running your Docker containers in Azure, all of the hosting environment is provided by Microsoft, and all you're essentially doing is scheduling what you want to happen with your container or your containers. But then, of course, you also are responsible for the image and the life cycle of the containers. But yeah, that's where I would put it in that service delivery model. And that is kind of the same area where I would put the so-called serverless products like Azure Functions, where there just about all the environment is abstracted away. Microsoft manages it, and you're just plunking your source code and setting it to run on a trigger, you know. So that again it fits in that continuum, but still behind software as a service.
Okay, got it. And going into those categories again, so in your experience, have you found one of those to be more cost effective than others?
Well, I hate to say the standard response. You know what the standard consultant response is.
Yeah.
It depends. Yeah, I mean, let's take, for example, IaaS versus platform as a service. You've got a workload right now that's running on n number of VMs. And if you've got a web front end, if it's a monolithic app like a web front end and an app tier and a database tier, and you want high availability, you're talking about a bucket load of VMs. And once you get those in Azure, depending upon the size of the VMs, depending upon the type of storage you're doing, little add-ons and bells and whistles, that can get enormously expensive. And then think of geo availability, where you need to replicate that entire workload, not just say in East US, but in West US or in Europe or Africa, you know? Wow. So the general guidance is consider platform services as a way to save potentially a whole lot of money. Instead of doing SQL database in VMs, consider Azure SQL database, which depending upon your pricing tier that you choose and how you set it up, could very much be a cost savings. But again, it really does depend. But I will say that Azure has lots of room for creativity. For example, I've used with customers in years past the Azure Automation Service, where you can run, say, PowerShell or Python scripts on a schedule to resize VMs. I had one customer who knew that he needed his VMs to run at a certain size during their workday in their time zone, but other than that 8 hours, they were just sitting there cycling. So it's trivially easy to run a PowerShell script hosted in Azure to either resize or just shut off those VMs and start them up on a schedule. So you can do a lot of that kind of creative costing in Azure. And even on top of that, you have a service that's free called Azure Advisor. And one of the things that it offers are cost savings recommendations.
Okay. And we have a few more exam questions. Do we want to take those later at a later session, or do you want to do those now?
If there's no other ones that relate to this session specifically, I'm happy to entertain them.
Sure. So let me just go through these really quick. There are a few more that I'll take before those. So how would you recommend gaining possible practical hands-on experience as a refresher right after training? Any suggestions would be great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mentioned Microsoft Learn, and their sandbox environment is really nice because it's totally free, and you are, in fact, in Microsoft subscription and you're working with Azure resources. So specifically what I recommend my students do is, let's say you're studying containers, let's say. Hop on over to Learn, do a search to see if there's any hands-on labs dealing with containers. You know, it's a nice way to do it. If you have access to credit, there are lots of sources of free Azure credit. Depending if you work for a Microsoft partner, for instance, you're going to have a recurring credit. If you belong to Visual Studio Online or have a Visual Studio license, there are ways. I found many more ways to get credit in Azure than, say, there are in AWS. That is another way to apply what you're learning. So look for hands-on labs. Look for opportunities for recurring free Azure credit.
Thanks. Okay, on to the next one. what would you say the time to obtain the AZ-103 or AZ-104 to become a Microsoft Azure administrator? What would you say that time looks like, as far as like the training, getting certified, and like really being able to step into that job role?
Well, I'm hearing a couple threads there. To start with, if you're talking about attaining the badge, the certification, there's no formal prerequisite, there's no prerequisite exam, nor does Microsoft enforce that you already have industry experience, and I'm glad, because there's nothing worse than that chicken and egg situation, that in order to get something, this badge, let's say, you have to have industry experience, but you want the badge to get your industry experience, you know. So if you're confident enough, you could sit for the exam today. So that, again, depends upon where you're situated with your skills right now and how prepared you are. We'll be talking in more depth about preparation in session 6, but I want to also underline how important practice exams, not illegal brain dumps, but legitimate practice exams are for preparing for Microsoft certification exams, because you're going to need to prove your competency in this computer-based testing format. And that actually brings up a good point. If you've heard of the performance-based labs that historically have been in the Azure exams and have been a little nervous about that, because again, these are sections of the exam where you're taken into the Azure portal and you're given a punch list of tasks to complete. My understanding is that Microsoft has turned that off for the time being. I haven't heard reports of any of the performance-based labs. Again, I believe was a decision based on the pandemic and Microsoft wanting to reserve Azure capacity for paying customers. But as a general advisement, I would say be prepared to see performance-based labs on your test and be pleasantly surprised if they're not on the exam. Now, as far as practically having enough confidence to apply for a job role, I'm going to say something that seems like it might be controversial. I'm not saying overestimate your skills, but the chances are you may be holding yourself back unnecessarily. Oh, I'm not confident enough to apply for this Azure administrator role. I feel I need to do this, this, and this first. Maybe not, because maybe the position is one that you can grow into. Again, it's going to be completely based on the company. But I would just want to encourage you to be courageous. You know, don't let that old imposter syndrome get in the way. Yeah, the chances are you may know more about Azure than the person interviewing you. It depends, of course, but I just felt inspired to say that.
No, I thought it definitely had a place there. For our next question, do I have to be a pro in PowerShell, CLI, or any other language to be an Azure administrator?
Great question. Do you have to be a pro? Not necessarily. I certainly hope you will become a pro. Which one you decide to specialize in, I would say it depends upon your interest and skill and what your team is standardized on. To be successful on the Azure exams, I tell my students that you need to have intermediate PowerShell skills and late basic Azure CLI skills, command line interface. I'm partial to PowerShell myself. Yeah, I mean, in my opinion, it's a core skill that any systems administrator should have, whether you're in the cloud or local or a hybrid cloud environment, because PowerShell, it presents a way to automate your administration, and who doesn't love that?
Thanks. Next one is the second session, Get Up to Speed with Azure Infrastructure as a Service, will it be practical demo oriented?
Yeah, I'm getting a sense that maybe y'all want some more demo and less slides, so I'll take that under advisement for sure. Normally, the way that I had structured these sessions, the way I originally did it was where it's mostly theoretical, and then I'll pop out to do a demo just to illustrate a point. But yeah, I'm happy to put more focus on the demo going forward. I don't want to lose the thread of the discussion though, because this isn't technical training as such. It's to make sure that you have you're aware of all the options and you have a nice to-do list to attain your goal of being an Azure administrator. which technical skills are a part of course, but there's more to the story.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for that. The next one, what is the difference between Azure Architect, Azure Administrator, Azure Developer, and Azure Engineer?
Okay. Well, the administrator, the typical role is you're the implementer. Let me frame it this way. I'm being a little bit stereotypical here, but the Azure architect is going to design a solution. This application seems like the best fit would be, say, in an infrastructure as a service environment. Well, here's the outlay, here's what we need. The administrator normally would be the person who implements the architect's design, is actually doing deployment, configuration, troubleshooting, maintenance. The developer is someone who's building applications that run either in whole or in part in Azure and is concerned with that. And then the DevOps engineer, again, it's funny you mentioned that because I was pondering that job role this morning thinking to myself, you know, my experience, the DevOps engineer, not only is it not really a standardized job role, but it seems more of a project manager than anything else. It really, but as far as Microsoft is concerned, their DevOps engineer badge is essentially you're demonstrating your expertise with the Azure DevOps toolset. It's not so much a DevOps methodology exam, it's understanding how to use the Azure DevOps tools in an agile software development kind of a shop.
Okay, and when we're talking a bit about Azure Engineer, diving into this a little more, is it a different role than Azure Administrator? Or should administrators target this? Should cloud engineers target this? What would you say to that?
Well, Azure Engineer is a little bit too vague. Again, to use Microsoft's nomenclature, they have a number of engineer job roles defined. They've got the DevOps engineer, as I've mentioned. There's a data engineer, and Microsoft defines that role essentially as a database administrator. I don't know if I've heard just Azure Engineer. That doesn't seem to mean a whole lot. It's going to be you're involved in the engineering of something. And like I said, DevOps would be Azure DevOps, basically, or a coach to a DevOps development team. And then from there, there's data engineer, as I said, there's security engineer, which is an information security professional who's specialized in the Microsoft Azure platform. I'm sure there's some other ones in there as well, but how are those distinct from the administrator? It's just a different emphasis. The administrator is mostly infrastructure as a service, at least that's Microsoft's definition. The developer tends to skew more towards the platform as a service and container as a service. The Azure DevOps engineer, like I said, winds up touching both IaaS and PaaS, but at least in Microsoft's nomenclature, you're using Azure DevOps.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and going into that a little more, do you see a lot of people getting a lot of different badges from all of those certifications? Like, say, if you do the Azure Administrator, would it be typical to see someone with another badge from another, another one of those unique skill sets?
Again, it depends. I mean, it may not be a choice. If you're working for a Microsoft partner company, for instance, they may be required to have a certain number of certified staff. So in that case, it's almost a compliance check rather than something that you're doing to broaden and deepen your career. I've seen as a general pattern, somebody get into Azure maybe in the shallow end of the pool and qualify at fundamentals and come out of that experience with a lot of confidence to go further. And there I like, as a mentor teacher, to encourage students to follow your interests and aptitude in your available time. So if your aptitude historically is skewed more towards administrator work, well, you've got that badge to look for. If you've always liked math, let's say, and you've been a programmer, a hobbyist programmer or beyond, let your interest and your skills and your available time dictate where you might want to go next. I mean, there is a gamification aspect. It's kind of cool to develop your little shelf of these badges, and they're very shareable. That's why Microsoft uses digital badges now instead of printed certificates, because number one, they're verified. You can click them and get a validation that Microsoft did in fact give you. You earned this badge from them. and you can pop them on social media, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But on the other hand, they're pretty expensive, so it's not something that you're just going to want to collect unless you've got all that money lying around to spend, and or your business is willing to finance you. That's always nice.
Yeah, and how valuable would you say the Azure certs are in the industry as a whole? Like, do you need one to be employable? Would you recommend one to before you get a job in that area? What do you think?
If nothing else, the badge is going to show a potential employer that you're willing to go the extra mile to demonstrate your competency with these skills and with these products. And just put yourself in the place of a hiring manager, that you've got two candidates that you've whittled the position down to, and otherwise they're equally qualified, but one has gone the extra mile to earn the certification and the other one hasn't, you see? So it presents you as a nice competitive advantage in the marketplace. Number two, it can be a great thing, like I said, for a compliance deal where a business needs to have certified people. And if you're coming into a job interview already certified, that's a great value add that you're bringing, because you're immediately saving the company time and money, aren't you? So yeah, I mean, I've found myself that I've shared my badges quite a lot over the last few years, because I've been asked by certain parties, you know, do you hold such and so a badge? And it's a really nice thing. It's a convenient thing, because one of the ways you can share your badges is just with an unauthenticated public URL. And you can say, yeah, I've got this badge, boop. And you can share the public link and they can see exactly when you earned the badge and what skills were involved in it. So, yeah, I think they're very valuable, hence the reason why they've gotten so much pickup around the world over the last year or two.
Yeah. And some more exam questions, but do you have any recommendations on where people can go to practice exams, practice questions,
Mm-hmm.
anything like that?
Yeah, if you're a Pluralsight subscriber, we have the Kaplan IT practice exams, and I don't know if they've published AZ 104 yet, but I know for a fact they have 103. So that would be an easy choice if you're already a subscriber. If not, or if you're looking for other sources, Microsoft's official practice exam provider is MeasureUp. If you go to measureUp.com, they're good. And I've gotten a lot of mileage personally, and lots of students have given me good feedback from whizlabs.com. They've got a very attractive price point, and I don't know if they've still got a site-wide discount happening, but they have had over the last few weeks. And all of those vendors, Kaplan IT, MeasureUp, WizLabs, are good because they're not ripoffs of the live exam, so you're not violating your non-disclosure agreement with Microsoft, but they give you a good feeling for how the live exam will work. Now, WizLabs doesn't have interactive items, which is a weakness. MeasureUp and Kaplan do, because you can expect to see, for instance, case studies on your AZ 103 or 104, drag and drop. And if you've never taken this kind of exam before, you don't want to go in to the live exam dealing with that for the first time, it seems to me, because then you're going to be wasting time trying to figure out the interface. No, so those practice exams are invaluable, not only for content review, but also giving you confidence in the types of questions you'll see and being able to demonstrate your knowledge in that way.
Okay. And how is 103 and 104, how are they different?
As I mentioned before, the main difference is just structural. Microsoft reordered the objectives so they flow in a much more logical way. And I don't know if anything was added in 104, but they did remove a few things, like Azure Functions is one thing that was in 103, but not in 104. And the reason why they did that, as I said earlier, is to reduce the overlap that existed between AZ 103 and the architect exams in particular. But other than that, I dare say if you were to take AZ 103 and 104 right after the other and you didn't know which is which, you probably wouldn't even notice. That's how similar they are, in my opinion.
Okay, got it. This one's from someone who is 6 times AWS certified and they work as a cloud architect and want to widen their scope to Azure. So what would you say is the path to becoming an Azure architect given their background, and are there any key trainings they should look at?
By all means. Hit up your favorite search engine and do a search for Azure for AWS. Microsoft has a number of very helpful docs. One of my favorites is a service comparison. There's a table that shows all of the AWS services and the matching Azure services, and it's almost a one-to-one correspondence. I think you're going to be very familiar as you get into Azure. So again, go to the Azure for AWS professionals in the Microsoft docs. And like I said, there are going to be very little surprises, and you'll find that you can leverage the vast majority of your AWS expertise into Azure.
Okay. And kind of broadening to the other clouds, are there a lot of similarities that you see between Azure, between AWS, between Google Cloud Platform?
Oh yeah, as I just mentioned, it seems that I need to be careful with my words. Let me start that again. Yes, there's a high degree of correspondence, specifically between AWS, Amazon Web Services, and Microsoft Azure, to the point where somebody who's expert in AWS should have really little to no problem transitioning to Azure, and vice versa. However, in my experience, Google Cloud Platform would be an outlier. They kind of march to the beat of their own drummer, and although their services, I mean, they have the same general categories, you know, IaaS and PaaS, etc., but they really kind of do it their own way. The good news is that Google themselves has some really nice docs on comparing Google Cloud Platform to Azure, let's say. So in that case, do a search for GCP for Azure professionals. And that should bring you to the Google Cloud Platform doc, where it does a service by service comparison of this called this in Azure and it's called this in GCP.
Thanks. So this one is, hey Tim, does it make sense to attend other sessions in this seminar series if I got the AZ-104 from Cloud Skills?
If you're talking about the training, I would say yes, because the focus here is less on the pure tech. Company like Mike Pfeiffer's Cloud Skills, it's all tech all the time for the most part. This, I'm not going to say it's going to be soft skills, but it's a healthier balance where we're skewing more towards softer skills and less on the hard tech. But like a previous questioner asked about more demos, I'll definitely do some tweaking between now and session 2 to try to find a better mix.
Cool. And let's talk a little bit more about certifications again. So is there a logical path, like let's say someone's starting out from scratch. Let's say I want to go into Azure. Is there a logical path that I should take? Like, should I do AZ-900? Should I do 103 and 104 or 303? What does that look like?
Yeah, there's a really nice path, as a matter of fact. Again, you can get the pictures going to the Azure docs. Just do a search for Azure role-based certs, but it looks like this. You've got your fundamentals level. That's the AZ-900, the Azure Fundamentals. That exam is a lot less expensive than all of the others. It's also a shorter exam. It's only 60 minutes compared to like 2.5 hours. So you've got the fundamentals level. That takes you into the associate level. And the associate level is where the administrator lives, the developer, the security engineer, where a lot of those, AI engineer, those are called associate level certs. And so there's no prerequisite, but you could, if you want to, step up from fundamentals into associate. And then there's a third level, expert, I think they call it, yeah. And that's where the solution architect and the DevOps engineer live. And the only expert exam that does have a prerequisite as of today is the DevOps engineer. You have to have earned either the administrator associate or the developer associate, and then pass the AZ-400 Azure DevOps exam in order to earn your Azure DevOps expert badge. There's actually a fourth category that Microsoft made called specialty. And again, it's similar to AWS, how they have specialty certifications. And that's where the SAP badge goes, and there's some other ones that are kind of one-off. Maybe the Microsoft 365 badges live over there, but Yeah, I hope that made sense. There's a nice, pretty linear pattern, but your choice of going from Azure Fundamentals to Administrator or Azure Fundamentals to Developer comes back to what I said about self-assessment and thinking about what am I good at, what do I genuinely like to do, and where do I want to go with my career? And answering those questions will allow you to choose the correct next step, it seems to me.
It looks like we're just about out of time. So everyone, thank you so much for your questions. If we didn't get to any of your questions, feel free to throw them into our next session, which will be next Wednesday, May 20th. And we'll see you all there. Thank you, Tim, so much for joining us, for teaching us. It's so awesome to have you doing this.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Alyssa. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Look forward to seeing you next time.